Okay, so this lecture's on the body keeps the score, and then we'll have another lecture on supplemental information. And, so chapter 5 continues the body-brain connection. And, I think that we're starting to look at some of the etymology. Entomology is study of bugs. Etymology is the study of language. Um, One interesting thing is that the Carnegie Museum of Natural History is one of the largest entomological collections in the world. In fact, what was the movie Silence of the Lambs where they had the moth with the skull on the moth? They went to our own Pittsburgh Carnegie Museum to find that moth. But this is etymology, and I think it is interesting the way he looks at some of the words. So, for instance, emotions uh, uh, in Latin means to move out, and it gives shape and direction to whatever we do. And their primary expression is through muscles of the face, so facial recognition, uh, body language. Um, so Darwin then went on to observe that the fundamental purpose of emotions is to initiate movement that will restore the organism to safety and physical equilibrium. Here's his comment on the origin of what today we would call PTSD. Behaviors to avoid or escape from danger have clearly evolved to render each organism competitive in terms of survival, but inappropriately prolonged escape or avoidance behavior would put the animal at a disadvantage in that successful species preservation demands reproduction, which in turn depends upon feeding, shelter, mating activities, all of which are reciprocals of avoidance and escape. In other words, if an organism is stuck in survival mode, its energies are focused on fighting off unseen enemies, which leaves no room for nurture, care, and love. So, needless to say, you know, Darwin, lived a long time ago. And this is a pretty basic concept. I think it does not include a lot of the nuances that we include today, but it's kind of like the beginning of these concepts that need to, pardon the pun, to evolve. And, I think that, um, it's kind of like just the beginning of thinking about some of this stuff. I think that, um, when we think about fight, flight, freeze, um, you know, uh, that is, really our response to threat. Um, but if we're stuck in that response, it is difficult to move back to our baseline. And it does affect so many other areas of our life. But I think it's a little more complex than Darwin originally thought. And we've come a long way since then, and we have a long way to go still. Um, so uh, they talk about a lot of different things here, but basically safety and reciprocity. Um, you know, a lot of the medication that we use today, and this is one of um, the things we discuss almost weekly, you know, uh, in the psychiatric unit where I work at a hospital. Um, it's that most of the psychiatric drugs that we use um, treat symptomology, but they don't actually cure uh, the underlying condition, whatever that might be. Um, it, it helps us to deal with the symptoms of that diagnosis or issue or trauma or whatever it might be. Could be a physical issue. Um, so, they're very limited. I mean, pharmaceutical uh, treatments really have changed people's lives. I've seen it. Um, but in most cases, uh, I think that an individual needs to continue taking the medication in order to relieve the symptoms that they are suffering from. Um, there are some treatments where, um, so for instance, if the psychological issue is caused by a parasite or an infection or something like that, we can definitely treat that. So that has kind of, you know, um, a biological cause that can be treated in most cases. In other cases, it can't, like mad cow disease, that is still untreatable. Um, so, you know, but when people have a diagnosis, uh, that might be the result of a chemical imbalance, that might be a result of trauma. In most cases, the the medical pharmaceutical industry can only address the symptoms. And that's not a bad thing, you know. That's, you know, a great thing. It relieves a lot of suffering, but it doesn't really create a cure. Some of the interesting things in this chapter, um, they do talk about some more physical things like, uh, let's see, the anatomic nervous system, sympathetic, which acts as the body's accelerator, and the parasympathetic, which serves as the brake. Um, so they talk about basically what happens um, when we have these two branches uh, of the nervous system, and one of them kicks in to give us adrenaline and to respond to threat and all of that. But the other calms us, brings us back to a baseline when the threat is no longer there. And a lot of times, uh, we'll have the sympathetic nervous system kick in, but the parasympathetic won't kick in. Uh, so, they're talking about how we kind of get stuck with these. Um, so the sympathetic nervous system's responsible for arousal, including the fight or flight response, Darwin's escape or avoidance behavior. Almost 2,000 years ago, the Roman physician Galen gave it the name sympathetic because he observed that it functioned with the emotions, sympathos. Um, so we're looking at kind of the language and why these things got their name and how they're connected with each other. Um, when we look at the parasympathetic, when we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, promotes self-preservance functions like digestion, wound healing. It triggers a release of acetylcholine to put a brake on arousal, slowing the heart rate, relaxing muscles, returning breathing to normal. All of the things that happen once a threat leaves and we feel safe once again. I think that uh, one of the things that uh, is really getting a lot of attention uh, is kind of polyvagal theory and I think another thing would be kind of like our vagus nerve really plays into a lot of uh, our bodily functions more than we used to think. Um, but let's talk a little bit about so the different levels of safety. And I'm just pointing out some of the things that I highlighted here, and then I'll give you some personal examples. Porges coined the word neuroception to describe the capacity to evaluate relative danger and safety in one's environment. So one of the interesting things is that um, people respond differently uh, to crisis situations. Um, so he gives a couple different things. Whenever we feel threatened, we instinctively turn to the first level, social engagement. We call out for help, support, comfort of people who can come to our assistance and help us. But if no one comes to our aid or we're in immediate danger, the organism reverts to more primitive ways to survive, fight, flight. Uh, so we fight off our attacker, we run to a safe place. However, if this fails, we can't get away, we're held down or trapped. The organism tries to preserve itself by shutting down, expending as little energy as possible. We are then in a state of freeze or collapse. I think it's a little more detailed than that. Um, I think we have the freeze response for more reasons than this. I think um, a lot of times, it may be uh, trying not to be noticed. It may be that very primitive, instinctual response of trying not to be seen or noticed, or um, to prevent more harm. I also think that many people experience dissociation or almost a separation from their physical beings if they are being traumatized. Um, and I've talked with a lot of clients who experience this, um, and it's understandable. Yeah.
So would you put the sort of depersonalization, dissociation under the freeze response? Because like I know people who under like extreme stress basically lose their free will, and it's like looking like if you say do something, they'll just robotically throw emotions with it
Yeah, so I think it depends on the situation.
because they're not frozen; they're just not acting on their own.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different things that can result in what an observer might see as a freeze response,
Mhm.
but a lot of different things could be happening, like, you know, maybe a cognitive inability to focus or something like that. I just don't think it's just one thing. I think there's a lot of possibilities for that response. Um, and you know, then they talk about the ventral vagal complex, uh, and we smile when others smile at us. We nod our heads when we agree. We frown when friends tell us of our misfortunes. Uh, when the VVC is engaged, it also sends signals down to our heart and lungs, slowing down our heart rate, increasing depth of breathing. As a result, we feel calm, relaxed, centered. Um, so, you know, one of the things they found, uh, our last chapter talked about mirroring and neurons that were mirror neurons. Um, One of the things they found in this study here is that uh, when a primate ate something, uh, that a certain part of their brain lit up. But when they observed another primate eating the same thing, the same part of their brain lit up. So they referred to this as mirroring. I would look at it almost in the same way as um, as kind of like an empathic functioning. So that primate is imagining what it would be like to eat that food as they watch the other primate. So I think that's what's actually happening. It's almost like a vicarious experience. Um, and, so, but they would call this mirroring. There's a lot of interesting things that happen with the concept of mirroring. Um, a lot of times, uh, when people begin to mirror each other, so they might sit in the same way, they might, uh, you know, like if I'm sitting like this, somebody else might sit across from me and take up the same posture. Um, if you had a client and that client begins to mirror you, it means that the trust is forming. It's becoming a more trusting professional relationship. The same thing happens in social groups or, um, you know, other types of bonding. And one of the interesting things is that if you want to build trust with someone else, you could begin the mirroring process because that creates a level of comfort, safety, and trust. And it's really kind of an unconscious thing. We don't realize it's happening, but if you do it consciously, it could create, you know, um, I guess, a more relaxed environment that could build trust more easily. Um, and I know, once I found out about this a long time ago, I noticed it happening. I didn't, I usually don't try to begin mirroring, I just want to be authentic, you know. But I did notice when it's happening. And then I paid attention to how I felt. And I'm like, wow, I really do feel more comfortable around this individual. And so it's kind of like, you know, kind of a affirming experience that I did experience this. Um, I think that um, they say I've seen so many different statistics about body language and facial expressions and things like that. Um, and I think that, on the average, it's between 25 and 50% of what we communicate is nonverbal in one way or another. Um, I do have kind of a personal example of this, and I do think that our cultural experience influences the amount of communication we receive from nonverbal cues. Um, so for instance, my roommate, uh, who was um, African American male, and we lived together, good friends for a couple years while we were in college. And I noticed that he was paying a lot more attention to people's nonverbals than I was. And we talked about it, and he explained that, well, he had some negative experiences because of bias and prejudice, because people would say one thing, whatever might have been politically correct, but they would do another. And so he felt as though he couldn't fully trust some individuals. And the one thing that he learned was to look at the nonverbals. Um, and I give more experiences like, you know, uh, my first concept of my privilege, as a white male, um, and just, living with my friend Michael. And things that I hadn't even realized were occurring socially, uh, just in Pittsburgh. And so it was an eye-opening experience, a very positive learning experience for me. And and but I do think that our personal experiences influence basically the importance or the amount of reliance that we place on certain things like nonverbals or facial expressions or things like that. Um, so here's an example, another example. Um, the I forget when it was. I guess it was in the 90s when MTV was still big and they had all the concerts on the beaches every summer. It was like Beach Fest or Summer Fest or something like that. And one of my friends was uh, grew up in like Avon or Belmar on the Jersey Shore. And you know, I knew that we came from very different childhood experiences. Um, and when MTV was at Asbury Park, which is right by her home in Belmar, um, we said, hey, let's go to the MTV show at the beach. So we walked down to the beach, and about an hour into it, uh, you know, she's like, well, what are you looking at, Grafton? And I'm like, I'm looking at the crowd of people and the various, you know, uh, groups of people. And she's like, why? And I'm like, well, it's time to leave. And so she's like, she wanted to stay. I'm like, let's leave now. We'll go watch it on television. And by the time we got home, uh, and we turned on the TV, the riots in Asbury Park had started at that MTV festival. She's like, how'd you know that would happen? I'm like, how did you not know it was going to happen? You know? But that's our personal experience, you know? Um, like it was very obvious to me picking up on all the nonverbals and everything. And she was fairly oblivious to it because I'm guessing she had never experienced those kinds of nonverbals. Um, and you can go on and on about this. Uh, so but I think that, uh, you know, to his point of mirroring and the way, not only the neurons, but the way we process nonverbals or use mirroring unconsciously or develop trust or mistrust. I just think it's interesting, and I think that part is pretty accurate. Um, you know, One of the things he says, he's talking about, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Porges points out achieving any sort of deep intimacy, an embrace, sleeping with a mate, sex requires allowing oneself to experience immobilization without fear. So I don't think I would talk about it that way. So, you know, and they're presenting a lot of information And it's easy to criticize once it's out there. But, I think there are nuances to this. And so, you know, um, I was like I've been doing this a long time, and I was one of the few people in the 90s in central Pennsylvania that saw clients who uh, wanted a sex change operation. And, I'm so old, I might not even be using the current terminology. But, you know, and there was so much prejudice and bias that, you know, even therapists weren't taking clients. So I was kind of the only one in central Pennsylvania. And when it didn't matter, um, whether, and because of that, I got a lot of supervision. I took extra classes, talked with psychiatrists and doctors. Um, so I started seeing a broader range of clients, basically individuals who had various sexual dysfunctions, whether they were emotional or physical, couples um, who were experiencing problems with intimacy. But ultimately, uh, yes, if there was a physical problem, I would work with doctors to help them through that process. Um, if they, uh, Most of the time though, I ended up talking about intimacy. And intimacy is not just sexual intimacy. Intimacy begins with being present for another human being. And it could be a stranger, it could be a friend, it could be a client. It has nothing to do with sexuality. It's simply being present for another human being. And with that presence, having the capacity to experience accurate empathic understanding for that other human being. And so I think in most of the cases where there wasn't a physical issue, or um, in most of the cases, they were not experiencing basic intimacy or empathy. They weren't present for one another. Um, so when I would talk to couples, they'd be like, why aren't we talking about our sex lives? Why are we talking about communication and being present and having empathy for one another? And like, well, I think we have to start at the very beginning, you know. And there are so many things in society um, that were just really getting started at that point, including the internet, that so many people were really not present emotionally or cognitively for their partners, whoever that might be. And, so we had to talk about what being present meant and what accurate empathic understanding meant. And, you know, where were they cognitively and emotionally if they weren't with their partner, mentally? And I think that a lot of times, you know, we are distracted or drawn away or fantasizing about all kinds of other things that draw us away from the person that we're with, even if we're just having a conversation at dinner. And so I guess where this is going is kind of like, okay, so when we want to develop a relationship, um, a lot of times, well, in the worst case scenario, people have experienced trauma, but even if an individual has not experienced trauma, people have experienced rejection. People have had relationships that didn't work out. People have experienced all types of negative relationships. And emotionally, if somebody enters into a relationship and they are hurt in any way, it could be like emotionally, could be experiencing rejection, uh, you know, just somebody saying cruel things. Whatever the negative experience was, people don't want to experience that again. And so we begin to build emotional walls to protect us in case something negative happens again. And so what that emotional wall does, it acts as a buffer when somebody says or does something that might harm us emotionally, and I'm not even talking physically, but emotionally, uh, it kind of acts as a buffer where we don't allow ourselves to fully experience accurate emotional pain. Uh, because we're kind of protecting ourselves emotionally with those emotional barriers. And it works, you know? And so, somebody might say something hurtful, or a relationship might end uh, negatively, and we don't experience that to the same degree emotionally that we would have previously because we've built these emotional walls. Well, the problem with these emotional walls is that, yes, they work when bad things happen, but they also work when good things happen. If they don't allow us to experience emotional pain fully, they also don't allow us to fully experience love and acceptance. So it works both ways. So, in order to love or experience true intimacy on any level or empathy, we have to take an emotional risk and allow ourselves to become vulnerable. That risk is the risk of being rejected, the risk of being hurt emotionally. It's taking a chance that we're going to trust that other individual with our emotions fully. In order to do that, we can't have those emotional walls, those barriers. It's hard to get rid of them to really trust after we've experienced emotional pain. So, you know, vulnerability after experiencing any kind of pain is difficult. It's difficult to trust. It's difficult to allow ourselves to become vulnerable. Um, but if we don't, we can't fully experience love, empathy, connection, intimacy on any level, let alone a sexual level. So I think that there's a lot more to this than the book talks about. Um, so with everything I kind of just expressed, which is kind of my viewpoint on intimacy and emotional barriers due to emotional pain, you know, and I'm only talking about kind of, you know, um, negative breakups or negative things that have been said to us or rejection. Imagine this at a whole new level if an individual has experienced abuse, psychological, physical, sexual abuse, trauma, you know, that's a whole other thing that um, is even more difficult. Those barriers uh, are perfectly understandable why the individual would do that. It's a natural, instinctual response. And because we don't want to experience that pain again. Um, and so sometimes those barriers uh, are so strong that um, there's an actual separation, an emotional separation, you know, uh, that's that's pretty fortified, you know, and it's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with that because there's a reason for it. Um, but I think one of the first things to be aware of is that it's there. There's a reason why it's there. And you know, um, and it's not, I'm definitely not saying it shouldn't be there, you know. I have certainly had those barriers in my own life, and I had to kind of address them. Uh, so this world, when we look at some of the statistics, which we will look at, uh, you know, is a dangerous place, and it's often unkind and traumatic, and you know, it's hard not to have those barriers in this world. All right. Any comments on that? That's just kind of what I've read and experienced and seen. He does talk about some new approaches to treatment. Um, if we understand that traumatized children and adults get stuck in fight, flight, or in chronic shutdown, how do we help them to deactivate these defensive maneuvers that once ensured their safety? Well, he talks a lot about play. And, you know, one of my experiences was I was working in a small town, and I was working in, uh, what do you call it? An agency. Uh, and all of the other 5 counselors were females. And I was the only male. And so I was getting a lot of clients that were young male children who had experienced abuse of all different kinds. And and I had just started my own practice. I was very young, had not been out of school very long, and the other counselors were great with me and supervision and treatment team, and um, and so I created they gave me an entire room as a play therapy room, and then I added on kind of an expressive arts area, and you know and I read Natalie Rogers. So Carl Rogers' daughter was one of the first people to write about expressive arts therapy. And was really into Carl Rogers, person-centered, Natalie Rogers, expressive arts therapy. And um, so I had a lot of success with play therapy and young children. Uh, Feeling safe, being able to play again and trust. I can give you one example of had a client who was about a 10-year-old female, and she had been held hostage at gunpoint, and the police were all around, and there was screaming, and you know, she was fearful that she might be killed, and it was a realistic fear. I mean, it could have definitely happened. And and so when I began seeing her, she would not step into the playroom. Um, and I certainly understood why. Uh, and I was, empathic. If I was her, I wouldn't trust anybody either. And and so I said, okay, well, why don't you just sit in the hallway and I'll sit in the playroom. And so every week, she would sit silently and watch me in the playroom. And sometimes I would play with puppets, and sometimes I would play in the sand table. And every now and then I'd roll her a ball and she would roll it back. And it took a month um, before she stepped foot in the playroom. And then eventually, she would play, uh, and but she would play silently. And after about another month, I think she felt safe in the playroom. And one session, she said that she wanted to share something with me, and she told me the story of the day she was held hostage. And I said, thank you so much for sharing your story with me. Um, I know that that took a lot, and I thank you for having the courage to share that with me. And before I could go on, she said, well, it's not a story, Grafton, it's true. And I've kind of felt devastated that, you know, with that kind of misinterpretation, I'm like, oh, I know it's true. Stories can be true as well. And, you know, uh, so, you know, after that, I was like really careful of what words and language I used because I thought that was a pretty empathic response. But you never know what's going to happen. But I didn't want to negate what she had just took that risk of sharing. And so, she did understand uh, that I believed her and I knew it was what actually happened. And then we were just able to talk about it more. But that was long before I read this book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I didn't know why play therapy worked so well. Um, but I knew it was a way that I could build trust and safety and give these clients a safe environment. And there was no judgment at all. It was totally non-directive. They could do whatever they wanted. And, you know, and I didn't even ask them if they wanted to do something. I simply reflected what they were doing. And so if you're in art therapy, you understand this. And but it was so much more than just creating a safe environment. There was so much more to it. It was allowing them to recreate things that happened that were dangerous and threatening in a safe area and in the mode of play and reenactment. And the every now and then, you know, a child would kind of look at me, questioning me, like if they wanted to pretend they were a younger age. So if they wanted to act like they were 5 years old instead of 12 years old, I said, that's fine, you know. And I realized that when I thought about it, they were going back to the age of their original abuse when they were kind of regressing in those earlier ages. And and kind of moving through that time of their life in safety and play. And you know, I think that so much more was happening than I realized. Um, but just having kind of that unconditional acceptance and, accurate empathic understanding and being authentic and um, allowing them to play and work through these periods of their life, uh, you know, I think it allowed them to become vulnerable again and take that risk to trust somebody, even if I was a therapist. And hopefully that was the beginning of, you know, maybe being able to trust others in the world. And hopefully that was a positive experience for them. Um, any questions or comments? Yeah.
How are you, so they're sharing. So what's your body language and how are you kind of letting them know like it's okay to say this and you're not like kind of because maybe some kid would think, okay, well, I've just said all of this and then I'm going back to playing, but you're wanting to make sure that you've heard them, you're not kind of blowing them off. Like what's
So, so he's asking, what was my body language like? What was my response like? And honestly, it depended on the situation and what was being shared, but I tried to be authentic because I did have empathy and I cared about them. So sometimes I would cry with them. Sometimes, I would just sit and listen. And um, honestly, uh, I had such an empathic response that I don't think I would have had kind of an incorrect body language, you know, because I mean, these stories were heartrending to me, you know. So, any other questions or comments, or maybe you've experienced something like that? Yeah.
made in the past similar situations where agents like I do well and only during activities, never during downtime. Children would come and be like, here's the worst story you've ever told, and also and be like, wow, I'm 19 years old and not qualified to respond to this. Like we had kids who like were in foster care and stuff, and you'd be like, my old parents that like just tell you a story of like neglected abuse, and you'd be like, wow. But
So you're at a summer camp and these kids are playing and they share a pretty traumatic story with you. What's your take on that now?
one of the reasons I came to this program is because it happened. You know, where I was like, I wish I could have something.
Yeah,
And
you
I feel like
wish you knew how to respond, and so you decided to come to this program.
if I tried back then, high chance I just made it worse or some other things. I always be like, that's really interesting. This is
Yeah,
not the appropriate time to talk about that. Let's just,
yeah.
but like it hurt, like you said, like it hits you like a truck. Like your kids say the stuff they've gone through like that.
Yeah, but it's also interesting that it happened at summer camp and play, and they felt safe
You know, acted, got
and built trust. Yeah, yeah. So they took a risk, shared their story. Yeah.
It was really fun because the disparity between the kids it was for like rich kids. So it's like a bunch of rich kids and then like three kids whose parents worked at the like club that it was hosted at, and they were like in foster care and stuff. Like very truly outgroup.
Yeah.
That was 19. What am I supposed to do about that? I am not qualified at all.
Well, I mean, that's why I went and got a counseling degree. I didn't know how to respond to people who I cared about. So figured I'd get some training. Um, all right, time is moving on. Chapter 6, losing your body, losing yourself. Um, so I'm just going to reread just the story about one of his clients. Sherry told me that she'd started to pick at her skin because it gave her some relief from feeling numb. The physical sensations made her feel more alive, but also deeply ashamed. She knew she was addicted to these actions, but could not stop them. She'd consulted many mental health professionals before me and had been questioned repeatedly about her suicidal behavior. She'd also been subjected to involuntary hospitalization by a psychiatrist who refused to treat her unless she could promise that she would never pick at herself again. However, in my experience, patients who cut themselves or pick at their skin like Sherry are seldom suicidal, but are trying to make themselves feel better in the only way they know. So, um, I think that um, I had a pretty unique view on cutting or self-harm. They started studying this, I guess about 5 years ago, um, to my surprise. And it seems to be pretty well documented now. But um, so when when I had clients, mostly teenagers, when I was consulting with CYS, um, and uh, they would usually give me clients that they weren't sure what to do with or how to help. And a lot of them were self-harming. And most of them had experienced some type of trauma. And somehow they had gotten into children and youth services. Um, but one of the things I noticed was that, um, you know, everybody knew at that time that, and this was before much was written on it, it early 2000s, I guess. Um, so the theory back then was that um, people uh, were so had numbed their emotions because of trauma that cutting created some type of emotional response. I didn't really, I mean, maybe, yeah, but I thought there was more to it than that. So, um, I was also at a different agency dealing with a lot of people suffering from addictions. And most of the people suffering from addiction um, also had a comorbid diagnosis. And, I was really making the connection between addiction and comorbidity and other diagnoses. But I really learned a lot about kind of the cycle of addiction and using and relapse. And one of the things that I noticed was basically that, if a person was trying to quit using um, drugs or alcohol or even smoking cigarettes, um, usually, they would be feeling okay, and that would be kind of their baseline. And then something would begin to create anxiety in their life. And it could be, that it could be socioeconomic, it could be relationship, it could be legal issues, whatever it was, could be arguing with a significant other. But whatever it was, this anxiety, started them up that curve, that addiction curve. And eventually, you know, they wanted to escape those emotions. And so when we think about, really difficult emotions, people want to escape those emotions. So even people with suicidal ideation, most of the people with suicidal ideation that I talk to don't want to kill themselves. They want to escape emotional pain. And they've tried everything to escape emotional pain, and it hasn't worked. And so that's, you know, one of the reasons why suicidal ideation begins. Now, there's other reasons, there's other diagnoses and things like that. But, you know, a lot of times it's really to escape extreme emotional pain. Um, so, so we begin moving up that addiction curve when anxiety and emotional pain begins to increase. And they know that something had helped them previously, and that was self-medication, using whatever drug, alcohol, whatever it was, could be smoking, nicotine, whatever it was, it had worked before, at least temporarily. It had caused all kinds of other problems in their life, addiction, but it had eased temporarily a lot of those emotions. And so using comes into their mind as a relief from that anxiety, self-medication. And as it continues, if the next step is them imagining the ritual process in using, so let's just use cigarettes as an example. So, the ritual of smoking could be I'm going to go down to the corner store. I know everybody there. I'll grab, a soda. I'll go buy my favorite pack of cigarettes. Americans, a lot of times they'll hit the pack on their palm, packing the cigarette tobacco more closely. Americans believe they get, a denser hit of nicotine. The cigarette is just a delivery system. And Europeans do it the opposite way. They move the cigarette in their fingers to loosen the tobacco because that allows more oxygen to get in and helps it to burn at a higher level. They believe that produces a better hit of nicotine. But either way, it's part of the ritual process, either packing the cigarettes or rolling them in your hand, in your fingers. And then they open the pack and, maybe they want to go for a walk, once they leave the store. Um, and you know even the sound of a Zippo lighter you know uh creates part of that ritual process. Now as the ritual process begins, the brain is anticipating some type of chemical interaction. So all kinds of stuff is already going off in our brains uh, during the ritual process. So as we're moving up that addiction curve, even if we're imagining the ritual process, we don't even have the cigarettes bought yet, but we're imagining the ritual process. All these bells and whistles are going off in our brain. I'm going to get nicotine soon. So once the ritual process is imagined, it's really hard to stop moving forward and actually pursuing the drug or drinks or cigarettes or whatever it is. And so then they actually buy the drug, they move through the actual ritual process, they use it, it has an effect on their body, and they're back at the baseline again. So let's think about cutting. So cutting, when the book talks about numbness, there may be an emotional barrier, or there may be a disconnection emotionally from our physical being because of trauma. There's probably also a lot of emotional pain. And so when we think about cutting, at some point, an individual has found that cutting changes emotions, and it changes them in a number of ways. So let's say, you know, um, we got an Amazon box and we grab a kitchen knife and we slice our finger open while we're opening the Amazon box. And wow, that really hurts. There's a lot of pain. When that occurs, our mind is not on anything past or future other than that cut. It draws us immediately into the present, away from the past, away from emotions, away from future anxiety and worries. And so the pain draws our attention. That pain is there, and the pain is actually in our brain. The pain is there so that we can automatically focus and stop whatever is hurting us from hurting us. Okay, so we move the knife away, we move our hand away instinctually. The pain did what it was supposed to do. Well, automatically, I'm not thinking about all of the negative things that happened in the past or I'm worried about in the future. It automatically reconnects my emotions with my physical body. And then the mind says, okay, it's not hurting us anymore. Now I'm going to kick in some endorphins and some other good chemicals to deal with the pain. And all of those chemicals that are created by our brain can also be enhanced through drugs and alcohol or even cigarettes. So it's a natural chemical response that occurs in our brain, just like if we had taken some external drug. When that happens, you know, people realize, wow, we look back on it, an hour later, I wasn't experiencing all of those negative thoughts and fears. I was reconnected. I was in the present. So, you know, a lot of times when my clients would describe what happened, they say, well, I was having an okay day. And then people started stressing me out and I felt threatened, or something was going wrong in a relationship or at school or in family, and anxiety started building and they wanted to relieve that negative emotions because then it started linking to previous experiences that were negative. And they began to imagine cutting again. And usually there was a ritual involved. There was a ritual of, I'll just give you an example of maybe they had a box under their bed in the safety of their bedroom. And inside the box, they would have memorabilia that meant something to them, and they would look through the memorabilia and feel comforted by those memories. And that's where they kept whatever device they used for cutting. And then they would lift it up, sit on the bed, and move and continue the ritual. And they would cut themselves, and all of those things would happen. They would experience pain. They would be drawn into the present. Mind would kick in all kinds of endorphins and other chemicals. They would feel calm afterward once again. And it would relieve a lot of that anxiety, even if it was just temporary. And so that's why I compared it to the cycle of addiction. And, you know, and so then I usually used a number of different treatment modalities, including, some that I would use for addiction. So it would kind of be a combination of treating trauma, anxiety, and addiction. That combination uh, is kind of what I found. Um, let's see. Uh, any comments or questions about that? I mean, there are some new publications on that now. Yeah, Bryce.
So I just looked it up and it seems like it's, self-harm, at least of that variety, is about 3 times as likely in women compared to men. Do you have a hypothesis as to why that might be?
Uh, so, I mean, there's no evidence as to why, but I think males often deal with it in different ways, and they usually use drugs or alcohol. But I don't have any studies to prove that. That's just my personal view of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, somebody here? Raise their hand, anybody?
So,
Go ahead. Yeah.
I forget what I was gonna say.
So when we think about mindfulness, it begins to talk about mindfulness in the book. And I mean, even from my own personal experience, um, so my dad was in the military. I didn't often feel like we had a good relationship. Uh, I mean, growing up, um, when he had to watch us instead of our mom, he would not read to us or tuck us in, but he would stand in the hall and kind of do a military rifle drill and twirl the rifle and click his heels, and we clap and say, "Do it again." So that's my childhood. But, another piece of the puzzle. But the one time that we did bond was when we would go over to the military base, and we would either shoot rifles or do archery or something like that. And the one thing he was able to teach me with that is breathing and focus. And so if I use, and then I became like an archery instructor at a camp for kids with disabilities. And we had the whole archery set up so that whatever their disability, they could still do archery. And so, but the whole thing about, archery is like pulling the arrow back in the bow and breathing and only focusing on the arrow and the target. So that combination of breathing and focus really drew me into the present. And that's why I found it so relaxing. And it's the same thing. it's mindfulness. And so then I really got into mindfulness. So this was 1989. Um, and so I even went to like India and went to like this ashram in the Himalayas. And I'm not very good at meditation. Uh, so, you know, but I was talking with this monk, and he's like, people try too hard to meditate. Don't worry about meditating. Just look at the pretty flame and breathe. And that I could do, you know? And like they'd ring this bell every 6 hours all day long, in the middle of the night, we're waking up. And but you know, the one thing over my life that I've learned is the how to combine mindfulness, or what the Buddhists might call a prayerful act, and being present for another human being. And so mindfulness is being present and finding meaning in whatever you happen to be doing. It could be doing the dishes. I go in, it's my turn to do the dishes. It's not one of my favorite things to do, and I'm miserable. But if I remind myself to be mindful, it changes my entire perspective of that chore. I don't know why, but rather than me like complaining and looking at it negatively, it brings me into the process. And it relieves all those negative thoughts and maybe anxiety or not wanting to do it, whatever. Um, but that's just doing the dishes. Imagine what mindfulness is like when you're talking with another human being about life, you know? So before every counseling session or before I run a group, I take a minute and I remind myself, be present, be mindful. Don't think about the traffic on your way to work. Don't think about all the chores I have to do after work or running the kids around. Just be present with your client. And there's nothing wrong with reminding yourself to do that. It centers me, it kind of grounds me. And I do it before it's become a ritual for me, you know. And if I wasn't reminding myself, if that didn't become a habit, you know, I might not be as present as I would like to be for people. Um, it talks about anxiety, and it says, we now know that panic symptoms are maintained largely because the individual develops a fear of the bodily sensations associated with panic attacks. Well, panic attacks, you know, often begin with a phobia or severe anxiety. And the interesting thing is, doesn't matter what the phobia is, it doesn't matter, it might be generalized anxiety, any type of anxiety, it could be situational. But if it gets bad enough to have a panic attack, after the panic attack, the focus of the fear is worry about having another panic attack. So it becomes cyclical. Because when people have a panic attack, it feels like you're dying, you're breathing, hyperventilating, racing heart, fear that is overwhelming because the anxiety is so extreme. Maybe some of you have experienced that. Uh, but what happens is then the phobia becomes fear of having another panic attack. And it could actually result in another panic attack. Um, let's see. All right. Questions, comments about that? examples, experiences. Yeah, Amanda.
Uh, so I'll give a personal experience, kind of tying together the like somewhat of the polyvagal theory and like panic attack. So
Okay,
a
good.
few months ago, I had to have some medical testing being done, and they had to put an IV in. And I'm not afraid of needles. I have tons of tattoos, like, and getting blood drawn and everything. It doesn't faze me. But when the nurse put the IV in and then they have to flush it, um, I had a response to that, which later on they told me I had a vasovagal response and I passed out. And everyone thought that I was nervous about the needles, and I wasn't. I found out it was because they pushed the fluid through too quickly. But just the feeling that I had before I passed out, I had like the metallic taste and I got really nauseous and dizzy and my ears were ringing. So now, anytime that like my heart will start racing, I almost imagine that my blood pressure is going to drop and that's going to happen again. So, it's interesting that you said, the fear of a panic attack, where, I don't think I'm having a panic attack, but I'm recalling those symptoms,
Yeah.
which makes me have anxiety.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's a really good example because it also talks about that physical response as well. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. What do you do when you are experiencing that anxiety? Does
Um,
what helps? That's what I'm
so
asking.
it's funny you mentioned that because I had it earlier today, and when it happened, I named it right away. And I can breathe through it. Like if I just take a moment and recognize that it's happening, and also know that it's not real, and that I'm not going to pass out. Like I'll do a little bit of self-talk and then just take a couple deep breaths and calm my heart rate down. And within a couple seconds, it passes. And it doesn't happen often or with any rhyme or reason that I can notice, but that coping seems to help just fine each time.
Yeah, that's good. Um, a lot of people like grounding, so like maybe looking at something physical or touching something physical or looking at your surroundings and focusing on various things that are physically around, like a vase or, something on the table. Um, and sometimes that grounding paired with breathing, you know, helps bring us more into kind of the present without the anxiety. Um, yeah, I don't want to get into it's already like 6:35. So I'm going to begin the next lecture next week because I want to talk about um, some of the supplemental concepts. Uh, so Thelma Duffy, she talks a lot about incorporating attachment theory and Bowlby and you know, uh, the you know, uh, other theories, um, like relational theories. Um, so I don't want to skip that, but I will just begin with that next week. So there's not a lot extra in your discussion board this week. It's just respond to the chapters. All right. Any questions or comments before we wrap it up?
I think I was looking at the D2L and I didn't see the week posted. The
This
week 4.
this week?
The 3 is posted, but not the 4.
Yeah, I'm recording it right now.
Oh, okay. No, but I mean like the discussion and like the.
Yeah.
Oh,
So when I'm done recording this lecture, I'll put it on.
Like you open
But
everything.
And I'll open everything. Yeah,
Oh, okay, okay, thank you.
yeah, that's right. All right. I'll see y'all later.